criminal case against him. But if they can show that he operated for political motives, out of animus towards the Bush administration, or because he's a disgruntled former Justice Department employee, then they think they might have a criminal case to charge him. So basically, Thomas Tamm has lived under a cloud for the last 2.5 years, uncertain whether he could get arrested any time or indicted. And ultimately, because of that, he finally decided to come forward. I had a series of many hours of interviews with him over the past few months, and we lay out the story in this week's Newsweek cover story.
Michael Isikoff, explain how this relates to the bedside meeting with James Comey, with then the Attorney General John Ashcroft, who was very sick at the time, with Gonzalez charging in.
Right. Right. It's fascinating because Tamm's concerns about what was going on inside the Justice Department OIPR office is coming at the same time that the Deputy Attorney General James Comey and the Assistant Attorney General Jack Goldsmith are raising concerns about this very same program. Tamm doesn't know about what Comey and Goldsmith are doing. He's totally independent from that. This is a separate track, but it's striking that at precisely the same time, Comey and FBI Director Bob Mueller are threatening to resign because of the program that the president has authorized and the way it's being conducted. And there's a third thing going on, which Tamm did pick up on, which I referred to before, and that was the concerns of Judge Kolar-Catelli. And in the piece, we quote for the first time the former chief judge of the FISA court, Royce Lamberth, who was acting as an advisor to Judge Kolar-Catelli this time. And he says on the record that Judge Kolar-Catelli had discovered that the Justice Department was backdooring intelligence into the FISA court. In other words, they were taking extra-legal evidence from the NSA wiretapping program, which is not authorized by statute, and trying to use it, essentially launder it, into a legitimate FISA warrant before the court, so they could then ultimately make a criminal case against U.S. citizens who had been first identified by this extra-legal NSA
now,
wiretapping
Michael,
program.
explain the significance of this, because while the U.S. says they're trying to gather this information in the war on terror, spying on U.S. citizens, they actually cannot use these the information they get from the wiretaps on American citizens.
Right, and that's why the Judge Kolar-Catelli's objections at this point, which were not known at the time, not publicly known at the time, were so crucial, because she discovered something that looked to her that was highly legally questionable, using illegal evidence to try to sneak it into a legitimate legal process. And some think this is where the NSA wiretapping program, or the fruits of that poison tree, could ultimately trip up the Justice Department. There are a number of criminal cases that were brought during this period that lawyers, defense lawyers, suspect may have used some of this NSA wiretapping evidence, and they are pressing in appellate courts and in criminal courts for full disclosure about what happened here. So we may be hearing more about that aspect of that in the weeks and months to come.
Michael Isikoff, tell us what else you learned in this investigation, for example, about data mining.
Well, yes, the sweep of the program was far more extensive than was commonly understood at the time. I think when it first got reported 3 years ago, it was that that the NSA was eavesdropping on conversations between U.S. persons and individuals abroad who were suspected of possible al-Qaeda affiliations. But in fact, the real part of the program that was the most extensive part and that was raising the most concerns went far beyond it. It was data mining. The NSA was collecting vast amounts of phone records and email accounts, times of phone calls, records of phone calls, records of emails, potentially hundreds of millions of these, and feeding that information into its NSA supercomputers, looking for patterns and links that might or might not suggest terrorist activity. Yet a third track of it was financial records, millions of credit card transactions, bank withdrawals, other personal financial records, where for the first time the NSA was getting access to them and feeding them into its computers. So what you had was a staggering amount of records, of personal records on American citizens, phone records, emails, financial records that were all being fed into these computers, and as the NSA began to look and sort through to try to find patterns that some analysts believed might suggest terrorist activity. The operative word there is might, because as we know, in so many cases along these lines, in that kind of link analysis, you could come up with suspicions about people who are entirely innocent.
The name of the NSA, the National Security Agency's phone call and email collection program, tapping?
The code name, revealed for the first time this week in Newsweek, it was Stellar Wind.
And this whole program began just after the attacks in October of 2001?
Just after 9/11, when, to be fair, and we should make it clear, there was legitimate concern at that point that there might be other al-Qaeda cells inside the United States, and a number of senior officials, especially led by Vice President Cheney and his Chief of Staff, or then Chief Counsel, now Chief of Staff, David Addington, believed that the FISA court was too cumbersome and wasn't fast enough and nimble enough in order to allow intelligence agencies to quickly get warrants on suspected operatives under the inside the country. Addington, according to Jack Goldsmith in his book, refers to that obnoxious court, the FISA court. We might finally be able to get rid of it if there's another attack. So it was that concern about identifying potential terrorists inside the United States that led the president to authorize a program that was not authorized by statute. On what authority did the president do it? His commander-in-chief authority in wartime. That as commander-in-chief, he had the authority to direct and order interceptions of conversations to protect the country. And there probably would have been a healthy debate about that had this been public at the time, but instead it was kept under the most super secret basis. It was probably the most secret program inside the government, and the extent and reach of the program was not fully understood. The extent of the breadth of assertion of executive power by the president was not publicly known at the time, and it was only later, and in large part, frankly, because of Thomas Tamm's phone call, that all this was ultimately exposed, and the country was able to have a debate about what was going on, about the extent of this. And of course, as we know, Congress last year, or earlier this year, passed a new law that governs the way such surveillance is conducted. The Congress changed the law because of the revelations about the way this program had been conducted.
And Thomas Tamm today, he was encouraged to plead guilty to a felony?
Yes, after the raid on his home last year, prosecutors tried to get him to plead guilty. There are two statutes that he could be charged with. One is called the Espionage Act. It's a World War I law that prohibits communication, disclosure of information that might be harmful to the national defense. There's another law from 1950 that prohibits disclosure of communications information intelligence. It's unclear whether Tamm could legitimately be charged under either of these laws because, as I pointed out, he was not, and he points out, he didn't disclose any sources and methods used by U.S. intelligence agencies. He didn't disclose specifics of this program at all. What he disclosed was concerns about the legality of Justice Department procedures. So it may be a difficult stretch for the Justice Department to bring a case against him, but the FBI has been relentlessly pursuing him. As recently as a couple of weeks ago, they interviewed one of his longtime associates, a former mentor of his, a retired judge, Andrew Sonner, who told the FBI agents off, telling them that if Tom Tamm did something like this, I'd be proud of him for doing it. Basically, Tamm's lawyers have been told that the decision on whether to prosecute at this point, at least before the story came out, they were saying that they were going to leave it to the Obama Justice Department to sort out.
Well, we will leave it there. Michael Isikoff, thanks you very much for joining us, investigative correspondent for Newsweek. His cover story is called "The Fed Who Blew the Whistle," about Thomas Tamm. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Back in a minute.